So let's do a bunch of rapid fire tips for leading your powered armoured super soldiers to victory in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today, rather than going for an individual focused subject, we're just going to blitz through a whole load of rapid fire thoughts on playing Space Marines, with 30 general tips to play the faction, perhaps with a bit of a focus on helping out newer players, but hopefully there'll still be a fair few interesting things for more experienced Space Marine generals. I had a fair amount of positive feedback for the similar video I made for the Imperial Guard last week, so if there's any other factions that you'd like me to cover in a similar style video, please let me know down in the comments. These will be aimed at more generic Space Marine armies with not all that much chapter specific stuff there, but of course all the individual supplement codexes do have all their nuances. Maybe we'll talk about them a bit more in other videos. In any case, let's jump straight into it. First up, Vanguard Veterans are one of the best Space Marine assault units. There are dozens of different combinations of weapons that you can arm them with, though the internet does seem to have decided that jump packs, storm shields and lightning claws are generally the best way to go. All of these add decent amounts of value for how much they cost. Jump packs get them where they need to be, storm shields make them significantly harder to take out, and not just a unit that you can blitz through with a whole bunch of high AP damage to fire. And the lightning claws are by far the best power weapon for the points invested. Extra attacks and re-rolling wound rolls mean they're absolutely great against hordes, and can also punch up against things like toughness 7 vehicles. You could maybe consider something fancier like a thunderhammer or a relic blade for the sergeant, as he does get more attacks, so he can get more value out of a fancier weapon. They're particularly strong in any of the assault chapters. Things like White Scars, Blood Angels and Space Wolves can get amazing use out of them. I'd argue the generic Codex Space Marines relic section isn't actually all that strong. Often you're going to be better off with some of the Codex specific relics in the supplement books. However, my single favourite relic is the Teeth of Terror. Just turns a standard guy with a chainsword into an enormous melee threat. Strength 5, AP -2 and 2 damage is just enormously generally threatening, and plus 3 attacks is amazing. It's quite nice that you don't have to pay for any other fancy power weapons as well. A few of my other personal favourites are the Benediction of Fury, the relic Chaplain Crozius that gives him a damage 3 and mortal wounds on 6s, the Armour Indomitus for protecting a important support character for 2+ armor save, +1 wound and a 3+ invul for a turn, and the Vox Spiritum is quite nice on Primaris units, giving you a nice +3 inches to your aura abilities, particularly handy on a Primaris Apothecary. Space Marines have a ton of firepower units. I'd argue that these 4 are some of the very strongest. If you want to crack tanks, I'd usually be looking at either Eradicators or Attack Bikes. Eradicators can be put in strategic reserve and then pop up and fry tanks for cheap. Attack Bikes are a little bit more pricey for the damage output that you get, not quite as durable for the cost, but of course have an enormous threat range and can fall back and shoot with a stratagem if they want to. For gunline units, it's hard to go wrong with the Redemptor Dreadnought or the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought with the twin Volkite Culverins. For Redemptors, I'd take the Icarus Pod, Macroplasma Incinerator and the Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and it should be able to deal with a big range of targets. The Relic Contemptors with the Volkites can be found in the Imperial Armor Compendium, and those Volkites do good work against most things, particularly infantry. Intercessors are a really good troops choice that's kind of hard to go wrong with. They seem to be the squad that's taken the most often competitively, and the standard pattern seems to be more popular than heavy intercessors or assault intercessors. Currently my favourite bolt rifle is the auto bolt rifle. It's got good damage and you can advance and shoot it if you need to. Maybe if I were playing Ultramarines I'd be tempted by the standard one a bit more, as you can move and double tap it in Tactical Doctrine. The grenade launcher can also be a reasonably priced boost to damage as well. An extra accurate crack grenade shot at 30 inches is no bad thing. Otherwise for troops, a squad or two of Phobos Marines really isn't a bad idea in most lists. Committing a couple of 100 points to taking the midfield, holding back enemy units that want to do the same, and you can either pick the cheaper Incursors for a bit more melee threat with those blades, or the pricier Infiltrators at 24 points, and they can put out a decent deep strike denial range if your opponent has things coming in from reserve. You can make them very hard to shift off objectives with Smokescreen plus Transhuman Physiology, and the Infiltrators can also take their Helix Adept, which could potentially save an Infiltrator's life per turn. For Warlord Traits, again there tends to be lots of decent options in the codexes, but perhaps the single most popular Warlord trait out of any Space Marine army is Rites of War. That's the one that gives your Warlord an OBSEC aura. It gives objectives secured to himself, any core units nearby such as Dreadnoughts or Blade Guard, and while you're scrapping for midfield objectives, it often might mean that you might take them for yourself, while your opponent might not have any OBSEC there if they're trying to contest it with their own elites. Otherwise, the Imperium Sword is great for a fighty character, +1 strength and attack and reroll charges. Wise Orator is nearly an auto-include upgrade on a Master of Sanctity to cast those litanies on a 2+, and so is Selfless Healer for a Chief Apothecary, as it allows them to use combat restoratives for free, setting up a model from the dead each turn. The cheap and fairly useless unit of Servitors really is a decent option to include in competitive Space Marine lists. The vast majority of Space Marine units cost 100 points or more, so being able to get mini units of cheap chaff for just 28 points has a big value all of its own. If you've got a line of sight blocking cover, they could be a very cheap way to hold down your home field objective. You could put them in strategic reserve to do secondaries like retrieve Octarius data. You can use them to screen, to move block, to stop deep strikers coming in where they're not wanted, and even do nuisance charging to hold up enemy gunline units, or have a go at contesting objectives for a turn. With a full squad on the charge, you also have at least a fairly decent chance of killing an enemy infantry model too, so while their damage output is pretty bad, it's not zero either. Not going to win you the killing game, but could well help you out on the objectives. Talking of objectives, Oaths of Moment is perhaps the best generic Space Marine secondary. There's just multiple different ways that you can score it. It's not too bad if you go first, but it's just ridiculously easy to achieve a high score if you do go seconds. You get 2 victory points for holding a unit in the centre of the board each turn. It has to be there at the end of the battle round. 1 victory point if you killed either a vehicle or a character in your turn, and 1 victory point for not failing a morale check or falling back. Provided you've got a couple of tough units to push the centre board with, usually you'll rack up a fair few of the other points without really having to try too hard. Transhuman Physiology is a really high value stratagem, 1 command point for anything that's 5 models or less, and it lets your Primaris units only ever be wounded on a 4 or more. It's very tempting to use this almost every time your opponent shoots at you with heavy weapons, provided you're confident that they're going to be trying to wipe out the unit. Hopefully it'll at least waste a fair bit of their firepower, or might even save the unit if you're lucky. It's quite a good reason to run Primaris Marines in squads of 5 or less, as then you won't have to pay the 2 CP. You'll get maximum value out of it if your opponent is going to be wounding you on 2s with something, say Strength 8 against Toughness 4, or perhaps something like Blood Angels where they get a +1 to wound on the charge. For psychic powers in Codex Space Marines, again many of the chapter specific disciplines are really quite good. I particularly like the Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Death Watch and White Scars ones. Otherwise though, if you want to take the powers from the core codex, I'd be taking the Librarius over the Obscuration discipline. And these 4 spells are my favourite, depending on what sort of army you're playing. Might of Heroes to empower a smash character, Psychic Barrier to make a 5+ invul bubble which could help Redemptors or something. Null Zone is maybe a bit niche, but when it comes up it's really powerful, stripping invuls away from an enemy unit. And Veil of Time maybe isn't all that powerful, but it will be useful quite a lot of the time, re-rolling advances and charges, and giving your unit always fights first. Successor Chapters are a useful tool with army construction. Newer players don't often find them the most clear about how they work, but generally you get most of the things that your parent chapter gets. Say if you said you were an Ultramarine successor, you'd get everything that the Ultramarines get in their codex, aside from things like access to special characters such as Rebute Gilliman, the actual chapter tactic itself, the fall back and shoot one, and you have to pay a tax to get the access to the higher tier of relics. They can still take the special issue war gear out of their codex section though. I feel like the most powerful successor chapters are melee focused ones, often using Whirlwind of Rage plus Born Heroes, both of which are just flat melee buffs, exploding 6s to hit and +1 to hit on the charge. It will make your average Space Marine on the charge an extra 50% more dangerous. Otherwise you could think about getting them there a bit easier, +1 to advance and charge with Hungry for Battle. And there are a couple of other useful ones, including Stealthy to get light cover greater than 18 inches away, or Master Artisans or Bolter Drill, both of which can give you a bit of extra damage. Some parent chapters really tend to lend themselves to successors a bit more than others. My top picks for running a chapter as a successor chapter will be Space Wolves and Raven Guard, both of which I don't really think gain all that much from their actual chapter tactic. Space Wolves have a stratagem that allows one unit to heroically intervene anyway, so it isn't really all that necessary to have it on every single unit, and they'll often want to swap it out for double dipping on the damage traits. Raven Guard I think really profit from Whirlwind of Rage plus Hungry for Battle. A lot of their stratagems are mobility focused, and they can allow you to deliver some powerful assault units quickly. Plenty of the others are maybe a bit more give and take, but there's some chapters I really not want to run as successors. Dark Angels, White Scars, Iron Hands, Imperial Fists and Blood Angels are all ones that I think gain really good strengths from their chapter tactics, and I'd largely not want to swap them out for other things. In general in Codex Space Marines, tanks just really aren't all that strong right now. They do spit out a reasonable amount of firepower, but very few compare very well against units like dreadnoughts and core units, where you can get some synergy on the go with rerolls. Perhaps some of my favourite tracked vehicles for the Marines are the Rhino, which is cheap and effective, Gladiator tanks, which can put out a decent amount of fire, Vindicators for being fairly tough plus readable anti-tank, Whirlwinds for a bit of ignored line of sight shooting, and perhaps more importantly handing out a fight last debuff with a stratagem that can be a very nice support to melee armies, and the Sicarian Arcus, which is fast, relatively tough, and does the ignores line of sight firepower thing a bit better than the Whirlwinds. For more standard non-Primaris Space Marines, I'd say that special weapons aren't in an amazingly good place right now. Melter and Plasma are a bit more expensive, but at least can allow the squad to threaten other targets. I'd say that Flamers and Grav Guns are fairly bad right now. Perhaps one of the best places to use special weapons might be Combi Melters or Combi Flamers for Vanguard Veterans, or run in a Salamander's drop pod, so you can drop down on turn 2 and have them all be +1 to wounds. Deathwatch Veterans can also make some good use of Combi Flamers as well. I think they just offer a fair bit more value than the standard Flamer. For the heavy weapons and the Devastator squads, my favourite choices are the Grav Cannons and Multi-Melters, both of which are fairly solid damage output, and they can make good use of the Devastator Sergeant with his Signum and the Armorium Cherub to have one model fire twice. You can deploy them via drop pod, which is particularly nice for armies like Iron Hands, who can get out and shoot with no penalty on turn 1, and even have reroll ones to hit as well. I'd say that missile launchers, plasma cannons and las cannons are all kind of okay for the cost. I feel they maybe pay a bit of a premium for the extra range, and I'd say perhaps heavy bolters are the weakest of the heavy weapons right now, and not usually want to take them when grav cannons exist and are also very cheap. For strong Space Marine assault units, these 4 are maybe some of my favourites. Blade Guard Veterans and Vanguard Veterans with their Storm Shields seem like some of the best picks. The Blade Guard generally do a bit more damage and are a bit more durable, but far less fast than the Vanguard with their jump packs. Assault Terminators are really quite useful for a bunch of different chapters, particularly Thunderhammer and Storm Shield ones in armies like Dark Angels, and a fair few chapters can make good use of Assault Intercessors as well to push back the enemy from taking their objectives. Whenever you're in the command phase, I would try and remember a couple of stratagems and options. Remember to declare combat doctrines if you need to change them, and in certain armies I would think about the 2 command point one to put one core unit into a different doctrine, particularly something like a really threatening melee unit into the assault doctrine if you need it on turn 1 or turn 2. If you've got a boosted assault doctrine like White Scars or Blood Angels, you could potentially be adding a crazy amount of extra damage to your squad. I'd also think about Wisdom of the Ancients if you do have a Dreadnought alongside some other core units. Getting an extra reroll ones to hit or to wound could make them far more efficient. If you're charging from reserve, then a fast-moving Chaplain can make a really good delivery mechanism to make sure your squad makes combat. Have, say, a Chaplain on a bike cast the +2 to charge litany. He then has an aura of this for the rest of the turn, then move him to where your deep striking unit is about to drop, then make sure that one model in your deep striking unit is within aura range of the Chaplain, and now that squad should have a 7-inch charge from reserve. With a command reroll that's really quite likely to pass, I believe you'd be looking at around an 80% success rate. Bodyguard Rules with company veterans can be a good way to allow your characters a bit more freedom of position. You could potentially have your company veterans hide out of line of sight behind a ruin, within 3 inches of a character that's outside the ruin, and then that character can't be shot by anything. It's pretty much ultimate insurance against sniper fire and can allow them to position just a little bit more aggressively, safe in the knowledge that they're not just going to get gunned down. The veterans are kind of handy to have around as well. They could function as another cheap utility unit to do things like objectives and actions. There's lots of different versions of plenty of the characters in Codex Space Marines. I did make a video on the subject recently, but these are some of my favourite loadouts for each of the different HQ choices. For captains, I really do like the bike-mounted one. For just 100 points, getting toughness 5, a decent shooting attack, and massive mobility is really nice, with the Indomitus captain with his Storm Shield and Relic Blade being an interesting other choice, and maybe a jump pack captain if you need to deep strike. For chaplains, I typically want to take the Primaris Biker Chaplain. I think he's worth the extra investment for his massive movement. For the Tech Marine, I'd take the Primaris version, basically similar to what you get with the standard one, but you get a whole heavy bolter to fire away with. Librarians, I think I could be quite flexible on. The jump pack is nice for the manoeuvrability, but it does cost quite a lot more. And for the Lieutenant, I'd take either the one from Indomitus with the Storm Shield and Relic Blade, or maybe the Reaver pattern for the different stratagems that he can unlock. Thinking a little bit about playing the mission for Space Marines, I'd usually aim to have an army that doesn't give up too many secondary objectives all by itself. I think it's usually fairly straightforward to build a Space Marine list that isn't going to give up loads of points from either Assassinate, Bring It Down, or any of the other kill objectives. Might just be one other incentive not to go too overboard on the characters. In general, Marines are really quite elite, so you can often hide a lot of them out of line of sight turn 1. If your opponent's got some heavy firepower, then that can be really quite a big deal. Other less elite armies might struggle to pack all their units out of line of sight. When moving up the board, I'd certainly think about using light cover whenever possible. Both powered armoured units and units with storm shields will really thank you for that. You could potentially get units like Assault Terminators down to an effective 0+ save if you can manage to tow one of them into light cover and really allow them to laugh off a lot of incoming fire. Most of the time it's fairly obvious, but I'd often consider charging light infantry if you get the option to with Space Marines. Obviously that's what you're going to be aiming to do with more melee focused units, but even 3-man Space Marine ranged units can actually pack a really decent punch in combat. If you are playing a melee focused chapter, and particularly if you have got to the assault doctrine, even things like Eradicators or Inceptors could easily have the chance to wipe out an enemy light infantry squad, so it might well be worth firing their firepower at something else and then charging down the last few stragglers of an infantry squad nearby. You can also use it to gain more movement. Space Marines have access to a ton of stratagems between their core book and the supplement ones. Here are just a couple of the more situational ones that I think is worth bearing in mind. For one command point, Death to Traitors is one to remember whenever you're fighting Death Guard, Thousand Sons or Chaos Marines. Just 1 CP for 4 rerolls to hit in melee with a powerful combat unit could make a massive difference. Rapid Fire is the 2 command point one for units of Intercessors, and it allows the squad to fire again at the end of the shooting phase. You could try and build around it, making a really big heavy damage dealing Intercessor squad, but to be honest I'd be a bit more tempted just to keep the squad small, focus them on objectives, and then just maybe consider at the end of each shooting phase, would it be worth another volley for 2 CP? Maybe if all you're going to do is chip a couple of wounds away off another enemy squad, then probably not. If it could make the difference between wiping out a depleted enemy unit that was going to do something nasty next turn, then maybe it would. Finally, Auspex scan is one to always keep in mind. Sometimes it can be quite a nice one to play mind games with your opponent. Even if it just makes them back off and position suboptimally, then that can be a good thing as well, even if you don't actually get to deal any massive damage with it. Certainly though, if your opponent does misplay, it could certainly lead to a unit being deleted straight out. In general, with combat doctrines and the super doctrines, Space Marines aren't really all that heavily incentivized to bring allies along, and most Marine armies tend to be run as kind of pure armies to avoid losing those benefits, plus the unique secondaries that you'd lose if you do bring other Imperial allies along. I still think that allied lists can be very strong. They do allow you to take the absolute best of a couple of different codexes and put it together, and in general, if you're allying Space Marines and maybe focus on things that have very high AP weapons, say for example Eradicators, Sanguinary Guards, Blade Guard Veterans, that kind of thing, as they're the ones that don't really care too much if they get an extra pip of AP or not. There's plenty of units out there these days that do things more efficiently than Space Marines can, so maybe you could team up with some scary AdMech firepower, or Crazy Sisters melee damage units, and in particular having access to any army that has some very cheap units on the go could certainly be a benefit. Servitors are good within the context of a Marines list, but there's certainly more efficient choices out there for chaff units. For transports, I think that Rhinos are really quite cheap and effective, but I think within the Space Marine Codex they kind of struggle for good units that actually want to be transported in them. Vanguard Veterans are okay, but I think they're far better run with jump packs, and for Stern Guard I think I'd usually want a drop pod. Razorbacks are a kind of interesting mix of firepower and transport capacity, but I don't think they're enormously efficient units right now. The Impulsors may be a little bit pricey for what it does, but does provide some really cool mobility. I wouldn't personally go mad on them, maybe 1 or 2 with some Blade Guard Veterans in. And finally, drop pods are kind of a fairly premium first turn deep strike option. They seem to be most commonly run with Devastators with multi-melters or grav cannons in these days. Being able to obliterate something right from the first turn is really quite nice, and as we mentioned you could use some Salamanders Stern Guard if you did want some +1 to wound melter or flamers. Usually though I wouldn't run more than 1 drop pod in a list. Eliminators became far more efficient in the new codex. 25 points per model means they're just incredibly cheap and effective for what they do, essentially being a Phobos body that's even harder to take out due to their camo cloaks, while packing a really quite meaty sniper rifle. A few squads certainly can threaten the characters, though at 75 points with those characters, I'd say they're almost just as valuable just to be chaff units in the midfield, expendable forward threats that can jump on objectives, maybe get killed by the first waves of enemies, maybe do an action or two, then you can countercharge with your own units. Space Marines usually come well equipped, pistols and grenades on almost every unit. If you're in melee, remember to fire your pistols. They won't usually do much, but they certainly can't hurt. And if you are charging towards an enemy, one model per turn chucking a crack grenade at an enemy is often going to do better than firing their own pistols or small arms. Can be a handy little punch of shooting damage that characters can access even if they don't have any ranged weapons. For the command squad characters, Apothecaries, Ancients and Company Champions, I feel that of the three, the Apothecaries are by far the most useful right now. They're maybe not handy for every single Space Marine list, but if you're running around with a ton of Gravis armor, Bodyguard Veterans, attack bikes, that kind of thing, upgrading them to the Chief Apothecary and allowing them to resurrect one model each turn is almost certainly going to pay for their value over the course of the game. A standard Apothecary could also be a good place to put the Teeth of Terror as well, to turn them into a mini combat threat too. Ancients I think just really aren't worth bothering with at the moment. Their shoots or fights in death mechanic was a bit more useful in 8th edition, back when the gameplay was all about building massive shooting castles all clustered around a few characters. In 9th edition, you're just a bit more incentivized to spread out and cover more of the map. Finally, I think that Company Champions are rarely going to be a particularly good pick. They are fairly cheap and efficient combat characters, and you can make them fairly scary by giving them the Chapter Champion and a Relic or Warlord trait, but in general I think that Captains are the way to go. They can basically do the exact same thing in combat, while also having a 4+ invul and a reroll 1s to hit aura. Also being able to take a bike isn't a bad thing either. And finally, talking Chaplain Litanies, I feel like Games Workshop have done really quite well with these, as I think that every single Chaplain Litany can be useful for the right army. Full hit rerolls in melee is very powerful, and quite nice to always be able to flex into that. 2 litanies for +1 to hit and +1 to wound when shooting can be great with a firebase, such as paired with a few dreadnoughts. He can get +1 to wound in melee, which is a nice melee buff too, the +2 to advance and charge that we mentioned earlier, and the mighty mantra of strength, which can turn a regular chaplain into a combat monster. I'd say of all the litanies, maybe the 5+ to ignore mortal wounds is maybe the most niche one, but even this one I have seen people running in competitive lists. There's more and more mechanics for mortal wounds being introduced into 9th edition these days, and with Grey Knights and Thousand Sons, I don't suspect there's going to be many less. Could really save you a few casualties against the right army. So that just about brings us to the end of 30 tips for playing Space Marines in Warhammer 40k. I hope you enjoyed the slightly more rapid fire format. Let me know your own insights with playing Marines down in the comments. There's got to be loads of other things that I haven't mentioned. Finally, if you have enjoyed the video, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to keep on making so much content every single day. If you have been enjoying regularly, the link is down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.